AIIA and ICRC's event this evening. My name is Nancy Schneider. I am the National Operations Manager for the Australian Institute of International Affairs. I am here with you tonight from the lands of the Ngunnawal people in Canberra. As I mentioned, this event is organized in cooperation with the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is an organization that routinely looks beyond the written and spoken word to communicate its actions and objectives. And although we often conceptualize art as something to be sought out, particularly within a museum, art really is all around us, and art is inherently political. And artists themselves not only have a unique gift for expression, but we as consumers of art are able to interpret it in ways that are of great significance to the message. So as they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And with that, I am very pleased to introduce you to David Tuck, the head of mission for the ICRC here in Australia. He will tell you a little bit about how the ICRC uses art as a tool for communication. David, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to this discussion on art and technology, a discussion on creativity in humanitarian and other related communication. First, though, I think let's us all acknowledge together the traditional custodians of this land. In my case, it is also the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra, and let's us all pay our respects to their elders, past and present. Indeed, I think there's probably an awful lot we could learn from First Nations people on precisely this evening's topic. After all, we know that they've been telling stories, including through art, for thousands of years. For our part, that is, as humanitarian actors, I mean, clearly we need to communicate, and we need to communicate often more, and always, I believe, we need to communicate better. We must absolutely avoid harm in our communication, and we must also somehow communicate effectively, both to garner support for humanitarian action and also to really exercise influence over behavior. So to persuade, or as some people call it, to advocate to humanitarian ends. At the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, we really are aiming in many ways to bring Australia and Australians' attention to the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Syria, and Yemen, amongst many, many others. Today, of course, all eyes are very much on Ukraine, where military operations, intense hostilities, and their consequences, injury, destruction, death, and displacement, are really compounding the effects of an already 8 years of immense hardship for the Ukrainian people. And that ought not to be forgotten in the context of today's discussion. Here in Australia, we are in many respects very fortunately quite distant from conflict. We're sort of at a very long arm's length from the world's major crises, many of which are increasingly protracted. The average length of the ICRC's 10 largest humanitarian operations is 42 years, 42 years of humanitarian action in our 10 largest operations. And the question, therefore, that we, I think, are constantly asking ourselves is, how do we get and consistently hold people's attention on seemingly very removed and certainly long-running crises? The question that follows is, what options do we have? What communication tools are at our disposal? Academic articles have obviously a very important place, but they are in some ways a bit laborious to produce and they're long to read. Blogs, at least in my view, can strike a very good balance between sort of investment and public engagement. And it's for that reason that with the AIIA, we run an annual Forgotten Conflict series, trying to return attention to situations that have sort of dropped off the radar, or we could say out of the news cycle. But what about some other tools? What about things like Twitter? You know, here personally, I wonder at times whether we are really capable of telling a humane, dignified human story, or unpacking a complex, fragmented conflict, or meaningfully explaining modern, sophisticated humanitarian methodology in 280 characters. So there must be, at some level, some other options for communicating. And there's clearly a space for creative approaches to passing appropriate, respectful, and effective messages. A voice that reaches target audiences, stimulates emotion, connection, and interest through, let's say, color, light, sound, song, smell, rhyme, dance, computing, or who knows, maybe even sometimes humor. In recent years, it's my impression that the ICRC has taken an increasingly creative approach to communication, which I think is great, by the way. And often it's been driven by opportunities and talent in our own region, in the Asia Pacific, in Australia, but also in other parts of this region. So we certainly use it, probably be quite obvious, we certainly use photography through things like exhibitions to show the extremely serious consequences of tribal violence in Papua New Guinea, or we convey, say, decades of humanitarian action in places like Afghanistan through photographs and the photographic record. We now, and I think it becomes sort of a bit more sophisticated, in some ways a bit more interesting in terms of the tools available to us. We now use virtual reality to bring people into our humanitarian operations. This is a technology that is constantly improving, but already I would say it's been a significant draw card for participation at many events. It strikes me as being somewhat unbelievable that virtual tools have been already described as slightly more popular than my usual dry presentations. In one of our virtual scenarios, we convey the humanitarian impact of overcrowding in places of detention. This is a very important issue for us, the International Committee of the Red Cross. And we do that by placing the user in the virtual reality experience at the center of a prison cell. As the user sort of looks around the cell, turns his or her head, more and more people begin to appear, gradually increasing what becomes a very powerful sense of sort of virtual claustrophobia. And this is a really simple design, but it is really remarkably quite effective. I think sometimes in the technological space, simplicity works best. Late last year, we collaborated with Asia Pacific artists in an urgent call for equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. Here in Australia, we've recently teamed up with one of this evening's panelists, Claudia Chinyere Akole, for a comic on the ICRC's role as a neutral intermediary. This is an important, if somewhat sort of technical aspect of our work. In very short terms, what we do is we facilitate agreements between warring or fighting parties to, for example, release detainees or to transfer mortal remains. In some cases, it's our impression that neutrality can be slightly misunderstood to be apathy. And what we really wanted to do is to show that, in fact, what neutrality is an enabler. So it helps us to do our most important work for those people who are most in need. Claudia's work, if you haven't had a chance to see it, really, in my view, speaks volumes for itself. It's colorful, it's striking. And what I really love about it is it really capably carries this kind of layered and complex messaging in a format that we hope reaches a greater or wider audience. So finally, look, I mean, of course, all of our communication must somehow be appropriate. It must respect and protect the dignity of all those people for whom we work. In our case, that's more often than not victims of armed conflict. In my personal experience, we have at times a kind of hesitation to use creative communication to convey really complex problems for fear that we might be oversimplifying or somehow demeaning people's very real and very serious circumstances. In my personal view, this ought not be an absolute bar to creativity. What it is, though, is certainly a call to assess in good faith and with our usual vigor always the potential implications and potential interpretations, potential misinterpretations of each and every representation that we intend to make. So with an enormous thanks to the Australian Institute of International Affairs, which has really long since supported the ICRC's humanitarian voice in Australia, and of course, with an enormous thanks to our panelists this evening. Let me extend a very warm welcome to Drawing a Connection Using Art to communicate complex issues. And with that, I have the absolute pleasure to hand back to Nancy of the AIIA. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you, David. That was really interesting to hear about how the ICRC is using art in practice on a daily basis, really. So now to introduce our speakers, we have a fantastic lineup for you tonight. We start off with Shelley Esguerra. Hello, Shelley.
Hi, Nancy. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Shelley is the head of the ICRC Regional Communications Center in Bangkok. She is heavily involved in these creative communications projects and is in charge of organizing communications in a way that are accessible to many, which she will talk about in a moment. Shelley has also founded her own social startup to tell the stories of nonprofits in creative ways, such as through photography, videography, animation, puppetry, and graphic design. And Shelley is an artist in her own right with exhibits in the Philippines and the UK. Next up, we will hear from Claudia Chinyere Akole. Hello, Claudia.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. Claudia is an exhibiting artist, freelance illustrator, cartoonist, designer, and educator. As David noted, she is the creator of work for the ICRC, a graphic image of the concept of neutrality, which you might recognize a piece of from the banner of this event. Claudia often engages with cultural identity, abstraction, and mental health in her art, and is well versed in creating art that is accessible to a broad range of people. And finally, we have Pascal Hufschman. Hello, Pascal.
Good morning, good evening, or hello, everybody.
Good morning and good evening. For those of you joining us in Geneva, from Geneva, good morning to all of you. Pascal is the executive director of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Museum. He is an art historian who specializes in photography, and he is a strong believer that art and museums create narratives that help us understand today's world. So with that, I will hand over to Shelley to get us started. Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It really is a pleasure to be with all of you, Claudia, Pascal, Bryce, Nancy, David, and everyone who's come to join us. I look forward to the exchange during the Q&A. Okay, so the topic that I'm meant to speak on is on non-traditional communication, with, of course, the overarching theme of using art to communicate complex issues. So alongside being a communicator for ICRC, I'm also a coach. And in coaching, there is a great importance in establishing definitions. That way we're all on the same page. So that said, I'm going to pick up on two aspects of my topic, which is art and non-traditional communications. So the Oxford Dictionary defines art as the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination, typically in a visual form such as painting or sculpture, producing works to be appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power. That's art. And then we move to non-traditional communication. But whose tradition and whose non-traditions? So my traditions are probably not the same as your traditions. And I'm making sure to emphasize this in the beginning because ICRC International Committee of the Red Cross, works in over 80 countries. And each country has its own sets of cultures, different means of communication. So for the next few minutes as I speak, when I refer to non-traditional, what I mean is means of presenting information other than formal letters, news releases, paper-based reports, proposal, and notes. Some of them David mentioned earlier. I have 3 points that I'd like to share. The first is using art and creativity in humanitarian action is actually a logical decision. David, you somehow touched on this earlier already. So for us, when we're trying to influence different communities to embrace international humanitarian law, being creative is not actually an option, it's a requirement. It's par for the course. To not be creative and stick to exclusively what is traditional may even be irresponsible, because that means the message may never get across. And principles of effective communication will tell you that passing on a message is never just about the message, it's how we pass it that matters. David talked about virtual reality and photography exhibits. I want to share with you a case where, not a case, but an example where we use street theater in South Sudan. The play was around the need to protect healthcare workers. It would happen weekly. I think this was in 2017 or 2016. It would happen weekly at a set day of the week, and it would start with loud music and dancing. So this attracts people and invites them to gather around. One of the volunteers who was involved said that, at the start, people would be laughing and they would be joyful. And then you can see the mood change as the story gets to the point of the hospitals being attacked. So this kind of emotional journey, it stays with you. And the message then gets more effectively passed. And then there's also, how do people use creativity among each other to exchange information? Because with the play that I was talking about, that was ICRC and the National Society creating an event for the community. But what about the community? How do they exchange information creatively among each other? This reminds me of a trip. What I want to share with you is a trip that I remember with my colleagues made in 2019, before the pandemic. It was to Vélingara in Senegal. So we were trying to find out how people know about migration routes, how they get information on how to protect themselves should they migrate, how they find out about coming back if they want to come back. And then there was this group of men we met, and they started sharing about their ways of exchanging information, and it was through rap. So they've performed a rap song for us right then and there. It was a joy to watch, and just the spirit that had them all collectively taking part in it. So there was one lead rapper, and then the others were performing backup in the sense of backup. And I'd love to share a video with you, which I have, but I don't have their consent, so I won't. You're gonna have to trust me that it happened. My second point is, for creative communication to be effective, it needs to be designed with consideration for people's emotions and their emotional journey. And this is what art, its creator, its curators have the power to do. Going back to the example of the South Sudan street theater in South Sudan, if you plot out the points where the audience interacted with the event, the emotional journey was deliberately designed. There's the loud music at the beginning that gets people together, and then there's the play itself. And then there was the processing. It wasn't just a, here's a play, goodbye. There was an arc to it. Taking it more to a digital situation, something that's perhaps less in an area of conflict, but just us consuming information about conflict where we are. Think about the last Instagram reel or TikTok video or tweet about conflict that made an impression on you, really etching the information in your mind. How do you think the content creator considered our situations when they created their content? Were they speaking to current concerns that a community we belong to has, helping the message not just land, but fill a gap? So for us at the Regional Communication Center, when we review the content that performs for us, they are the ones that are not just creative, but also strategic. My last point is, using art and creativity in humanitarian action has the power to both break barriers and build barriers. A communication product that ICRC worked on during the pandemic that I want to share for this particular point is coloring sheets for children. The coloring sheets contained messages on how to protect oneself. So this happened at the time when information was still largely being passed around through posters, leaflets, loudspeakers, being shared with community leaders, so from one adult to another. And the scenario here is camps for internally displaced persons. So what about the children? How do they protect themselves? How do they actually have information that they understand? And the coloring sheets did that. It was in their language. It was illustrated in ways that were attractive to them. And they had time to, because they're coloring it, there's time for them to process the information, and it helps to stick, right? It's not just, this is what you should do. You should wash your hands for 20 seconds. So that's an example that I wanted to share on how art can break barrier of access. And then let's move to the flip side, which is when creativity and art builds barriers. There's the accessibility angle, right? Art is built with the senses in mind. visual for seeing, music for hearing. Some experiential art require a consumer of art to be able-bodied. So if an installation is in a museum or an event space, who can afford to go there? Who has the capability to go there? Who can afford to create the art? Whose art gets noticed? And then there's the story angle. How do we in humanitarian space use art to uplift communities and not portray them into a singular narrative of suffering? Does the art we invest in also show the different strengths of the communities? So I'm going to pause here. I've used up my time, and I just want to end with the role of creativity and humanitarian action is necessary. Whether it will be good or harmful depends on how we make it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shelley, for that really interesting assessment of art and its many different forms, and also its level of accessibility and barriers to accessibility. That was wonderful. I just want to remind our audience who are following along that the Q&A function is open in this webinar. So as the speakers are talking, if something that they say sparks your interest, if there's something that you want to know more about, please do put that in the Q&A function. And I believe that the upvote function is also turned on. So if somebody else asks a question that you find particularly interesting, feel free to give them kudos as well. All right, so next up, we are going to go to Claudia.
Hi, Nancy, and thank you so much for having me. I just want to quickly start by saying that I'm speaking today from Wongal country, where I've been born and raised. So I live and work on Wongal and Gadigal country, so that's Sydney and Inner West Sydney. So I'd like to offer my respects to elders past and present, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where I live and work. I'm Claudia Chinyere Akole. I'm an illustrator, animator, cartoonist, and educator based here in Sydney. And so as discussed earlier, I did have the pleasure of creating a kind of long form single scrolling comic piece with the ICRC about their role as a neutral intermediary in international humanitarian issues. So I think we've already kind of touched on a few general points about how art and creative communication are intertwined with humanitarian issues, issues of social justice, issues of generally communicating one's existence or one's way of life to other people. So I think it's important to note in this discussion that art and human expression are kind of irrevocably intertwined. So humans have been expressing themselves and communicating their stories through art since humans have existed for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So cartooning in particular, the format of comics has a very long, steeped history in nonfiction works, in political cartooning, in autobiographical nonfiction kind of works. And one thing that I wanted to kind of point out about this comic piece that I made with the ICRC is the role of a humanitarian organization in publishing work like this kind of overwrites the internet's general, like cadence to approach art that is about humanitarian issues or social justice in bad faith. So I think the ICRC publishing a work like this, where it's coming from the source, it increases the accessibility that someone can have to have a positive conversation about the work and a positive conversation about the situation being described, instead of the comment section of every political cartooning site is usually people at each other's throats. So yeah, I firstly want to say that I found it extremely humbling, and I was extremely privileged to create this work because it tackles a few difficult points in that the way that we communicate the story can't be too specific, because as discussed, ICRC operates in 80 different countries. So we can't simply visualize one single culture, one single conflict, one single war, because this is a repeating instance that happens throughout human history. And it's something that if we can describe it in a general way, people are more likely to empathize with it, and people are more likely to actually absorb the information realize that this can happen to anyone. And even though we are far away down here in Australia, it really is something that we can all take note of rather than just separate ourselves from it emotionally because it's happening elsewhere. Then on the second point of the different mediums that visual work can take when it's kind of adjacent to humanitarian work. I've seen, what's the word, sorry. I'm trying to explain that I know so many people who, as an artist, our role in large-scale conflicts and our role in large-scale crises and our role in large-scale global events like a pandemic, we feel like we're the kind of people who shouldn't put out, like, we don't feel like we're very responsible to be taking the mic and talking, but we also have this craving urge to try and communicate it visually, to try and understand it visually, because that's how we think. So I think this overlap of the way humans communicate and how artists inherently communicate visually, even to themselves, is the reason why humanitarian issues and social issues constantly overlap with art. It's kind of the first place where people go. I have friends and colleagues who work, who devote their lives to social projects like the Refugee Art Project, to creating long-standing VR effects like the re-education VR documentary by Maddie Hyun about the Xinjiang re-education camps. I have so many friends who use visuals and kind of devote their time and their resources to real life social issues and real life humanitarian issues, because not just because they're artists, but because as humans, that's what we want to do. We want to communicate about these things that the world is experiencing, and we want to try and understand them ourselves visually. So that kind of comes around to my final point, which is about how we respect the parties who are the focal point of these issues. And that's a really difficult one that I think kind of doesn't get addressed very well a lot of the time. A lot of people have this kind of voyeuristic savior approach to creating work about issues that are happening in other countries, or issues that are so long-standing and have such complex histories that the artists themselves may not actually understand what they're communicating. So I think that's why it's important for kind of commission or partnerships or contracting kind of relationships with organizations like ICRC and an independent artist like me. I think that's kind of the best way to have a kind of impartial eye that's well informed over the work, instead of it just being created from one individual's perception, and so that it isn't coming from a place, of superiority, because that tends to happen a lot with artists from Western nations. So yeah, I think art and humanitarian issues are intertwined. They always have been, and that's just a way that humans communicate their suffering and how they communicate big changes in their life and how they communicate things we don't understand. So I think, yeah, this importance on having a working relationship with the organizations that are kind of on the front lines with artists is a hand-in-hand solution to a lot of the ethical and moral kind of issues that we have. And on that, I'd like to give it back to Nancy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That was fascinating. I mean, our artists have always been at the center of conflict, and the ICRC by design is at the center of conflict. And so hearing how there's two different kind of interpretations of being at the center of conflict, I thought that was really interesting. Thank you so much for that. And finally, last but not least, we are going to hear from Pascal. Go ahead, Pascal.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me with you. It's a great pleasure. I traveled to Australia 3 years ago, and I loved it there. And when I was there, I also paid my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So I'll do it again from here in Switzerland. I grabbed a book as I was listening to you, this one in my bookshelf, which is A Souvenir of Solferino published by Henri Dunant in 1862, which really sparked the entire organization of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, and in many ways the reasons why we're talking together today. And it's very interesting for me to always remember that Henri Dunant in the 19th century could have given lectures, could have published articles in newspapers, but to the contrary, he decided to write a book. And I don't know if you've read it, but the first part is very factual, and he's trying to give a very objective analysis of the situation. But then as you move on, it becomes extremely subjective, and there is something very emotional to it, which makes it probably one of the most efficient publications in history, because when you look at it, between 1862 and the creation of the Geneva Conventions, there's practically nothing. So this is what you could call a work of art. It is not a fictional novel, but it's close to what we could call a book in the art term. And I'd like to remind this just to state the incredible power that art can have when it connects to humanitarian work. Also, I'd like to say as a kind of introduction that I will refer to art, but this is not only visual, this is dance, theater, writing, any type of creative activity which goes far beyond visual arts. So I'm talking to you from Geneva, in a museum which I love. I joined 3 years ago, and with my colleagues, we're placing one single question at the heart of everything we do. It's a very simple and complex question at the same time, which is, what does it have to do with me? Because we all know the Red Cross, we all know the Red Crescent. For many, many people in the Western world, and especially in this privileged country in Switzerland, humanitarian action is something you hear about every day in the news. It's a moment in your day. You're commuting to work, you're reading news about Ukraine, you'll read an article in the paper, you'll switch on TV, and you'll engage with this information, and then perhaps you'll switch off your phone, close your newspaper, and move on with your day. And there's no judgment in this, it's just a fact. For many, many people who are not professional workers in the field of humanitarian action, or who are not directly impacted by these matters, well, it's in a piece of news. And I'm very curious about this, because the very ways of communicating this information can comfort you in thinking that it's happening elsewhere, far from you. Because indeed, you switch the phone off and Ukraine kind of goes away. And we've been brought up in such a way in this part of the world that we often think that there's something happening over there to other people and there's my life here. And I would very much like with my colleagues to disrupt this way of thinking. And a very efficient way of doing this is especially by working with artists and bringing them in a conversation between humanitarian workers and my visitors here, so that they can look at the incredible dilemmas of humanitarian action, that they can look at the incredible complexity of humanitarian action, dilemma and complexity that never ever make it to the 1 minute, 30-second story in the news, and that these artists can then freely create content on the basis of this complexity, and through this content invite a much, much broader audience, in other words, our visitors, to engage with what's at stake. So I'd like to give you 3 key ideas, and then we can perhaps discuss them and bring them all together in the conversation with the very valid and interesting points you made. The first one is to acknowledge the fact that humanitarian workers and artists don't really know each other. These are 2 very different communities that, in my experience, seem to have very often preconceived ideas of one another. So, oh, you're a humanitarian worker, or you work for the Red Cross, that's what you do. And oh, you're an artist, so you paint abstract things, and cool, good for you. So that's a very, very simplified conversation, but I hear it so many times that I often use it as a way of saying, okay, that's good, let's work on assumptions and bring these two communities to first know, listen, and understand each other. It takes diplomacy, it takes creating safe conversations, but it's so important that both parties understand each other to especially step away from many of the concerns that were already expressed: oversimplification of humanitarian work, voyeurism, and things that fundamentally are not interesting. So that's the first point. Humanitarian workers and artists can learn to know each other better. A second point is, I think in any theory of complexity, at one point or another will be stated the fact that we need many different parts of our brain to understand complex issues. We usually engage with complexity in a way that has proven efficient already. So we repeat ways of learning information or engaging with information or communicating information or even solving problems that have been efficient already once. But beyond the neuropsychological fact, it's also true that we can use many different parts of our brain and of our beings to engage with issues that are of such complexity that only one way of saying or only one way of thinking will never, ever be enough. And this is so true with humanitarian action. Humanitarian action evolves in contexts that are ever shifting, that are multifaceted, that are in constant adaptation, and that require such a level of an awareness of what's at stake that perhaps, as you were saying, David, one single article or one single photograph or even one single artwork cannot wrap your head around it. And yes, art is a very interesting way to add to this approach of complexity. I would never oppose complexity to creativity for this very reason. To the contrary, creativity can help our rational aspect of our brain better understand what's at stake. Another big point, I think, is that art can build, and artists can build extremely powerful connections and conversations. We've already quickly touched upon this in the points that have been made so far. I'd perhaps like to give you 3 examples of my recent work, just to exemplify this. The 33rd International Conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent in Geneva, December 2019, just before the world changed. 3,000 people came to Geneva to discuss the humanitarian priorities and issues of the next 4 years. Heads of state, the entire movement of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, so much at stake. And for people here in Geneva, that's another international conference at the heart of international Geneva, where locals will not have access because they don't have a badge and the security levels are super high. And where local people who speak French will think, yeah, well, you know, they're just disrupting traffic. And anyway, I don't speak English, so what do I have to do with this? And it's just another conference happening in Geneva. And for the people coming in, it's also a very standard experience that you might fly from Australia all the way to Geneva to attend your conferences. You're booked with meetings to no end. So you wake up in your hotel room and you get to the end of the day and you just can't move anymore because you're so tired, and you go to bed, and then you fly out and you haven't met anybody in the local city, and building these connections is kind of difficult. So what we decided with my colleagues was to use our heritage of 15,000 posters of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, which were made throughout history by extremely creative people from all over the world in every national society. And we thought that we would adapt a set of these posters to a postcard format, and that we would give 3,000 postcards to 3,000 school children aged 8 to 12 here in Geneva, telling them, hey, you know what? This poster tells you something about the world, and it just so happens that 3,000 grown-ups are coming to your city in December to discuss your future, fundamentally. So what message would you like to give them? What would you like them to talk about? So we invited them to write handwritten messages on these 3,000 postcards with a huge educational kit around it. And then we took these postcards and slipped one postcard in every welcome pack of every delegate at the conference, including heads of states, diplomats, and so on. And for me, that's exactly what a museum is. Because then when Peter Maurer arrived on stage and welcomed everybody to the conference, he said, I am very honored to welcome you all to Geneva, and I am not alone in doing so. I am welcoming you along with 3,000 children who are concerned about poverty, about war, about climate change, and it's our duty to rise up to their expectations. And this entire conversation is based on posters and creative visual contributions of Red Cross, Red Crescent societies around the world, which are kept now in a museum. So that's just one example. I'll keep the two others for later. That shows what kind of connections this can support. Finally, I'd like to say that, and especially in the context of protracted conflicts, we should never, ever, ever forget that artists are incredible community leaders. An artist is never someone alone in a bubble, kind of hovering around the world and not being connected to reality. Artists know people, are connected with so many peers, and understand the deep, deep complexity and subtlety of unfolding conflicts or complex situations. And I'd never stress enough the fact that humanitarian workers in the field can refer to artists as community leaders, learn from them in better ways of engaging stakeholders, engaging conversations, which, and there are so many examples that come to mind, are so important. This is true, for example, in Lebanon, where street theater was essential in recovering after the explosion. This was true, I have another example that comes to mind in Afghanistan, where creative art enabled a process of memorialization and mourning. And here, really, we have allies in both the humanitarian field and the art field. So finally, I think my big mantra is to always say that artists are peers. They are not communicators. They are people whose job it is to communicate. Artists go beyond communication. Artists provide a different way of understanding and thinking, and especially I think that humanitarian people can learn so much from artists the second and the moment they see and understand them as peers. So that's for me so far.
Thank you so much, Pascal. I think that message can really extend to kind of everyone in a position of authority or power, or with any amount of decision making that is represented through art. I think if artists are looked at as peers rather than as communicators, I think that would take things a long way. So thank you so much to all of our speakers for their fantastic opening statements. I learned a lot. I have a lot of questions for you. Hopefully our audience has some questions as well. There are some in the chat already. Please do feel free to ask whatever you want of these speakers, of these experts, within reason. Joining us tonight for the discussion will be the AIA's National Executive Director, Dr. Bryce Wakefield. Bryce, before working at the AIA, was a lecturer at Leiden University, where he taught courses on Japan and East Asia, Japanese and East Asian politics, and he also taught courses on the relationships between politics and culture, especially the interaction between Japanese politics and how that was expressed through anime and manga. So if there are things that touch on a more, or I suppose go beyond the humanitarian space, I think Bryce will hop in to provide his two cents. Hello, Bryce.
Hi, Nancy. I have a question already, if that's all right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, let me refine that introduction a bit. I was a lecturer on international relations and politics. The manga thing was a bit of a side gig, but it actually became a core part of my teaching, at least. Where it started was I just wanted to create a course to make Japan studies students actually interested in politics and international relations as seen through a Japanese lens. And there's plenty out there in Japan in the sort of, I didn't know this at the time, but in Japanese popular culture in general, of course, but in manga and anime, because as some of you might know, manga is an adult art form in Japan as well as a child's art form. Anybody, there's no sort of stigma as to who can read it, and it covers for that reason a wide range of topics. Now, I don't want to sort of I don't want to sort of cast aspersions with that statement, but it is actually well recognized. I think that in the West, comics are often seen as a more childish medium, and they're not, obviously. I mean, you can express very sophisticated concepts with comics, but I wonder how you get over that kind of approach, or whether it's helpful in some ways to adopt the notion that certain media are for certain people. We've already heard Shelley, for example, talk about rap music. There are probably certain demographics to whom those sorts of media don't appeal. Is it that we're taking particular art forms and aiming them at particular people, or are we attempting to widen the space to tell stories about humanitarian issues and the role of the ICRC to everyone? Claudia, you're nodding, sorry.
I'm nodding, but I'm curious what the shortened version of the question was.
Okay, so the closed shortened version of the question is the media that we produce, does it tend to close off audiences in some ways? So depending on the particular media that we're using.
I think in some cases, definitely yes, not just from an accessibility standpoint about really similar to what Shelley already said about viewers needing to be able-bodied to experience the art a certain way versus artists creating work in purely visual mediums, purely audio mediums. I think there are a lot of long-standing stereotypes about comics, especially being for children, or animated films being for children. But I think that's also a very, that's like a very Western post-colonial kind of view, because there are plenty of other cultures where such forms of visual communication are almost ingrained in the culture itself. Japan is a really wonderful example of that. France is another example. They have a long-standing history of bande dessinée. So a lot of places where you would consider mediums that we currently consider childish often have a completely flipped perception depending on the culture. So it's a very difficult question to have a solid answer to, because it's constantly changing and it's a bit intangible depending on who the audience is. Yeah.
Thank you, Claudia. Shelley, would you like to hop in there as well with an answer?
Sure. My answer is rather short, and it's that yes, it does. That's why we make more. So we don't just make one thing. We make multiple things for multiple audiences.
That makes a lot of sense. Following on from that, I have a question that I would like to pose first to Shelley and then to, I think, Pascal and even David. I'm happy for you to hop in on this one as well. You know, our art is notorious for falling victim to budget cuts. There is the trope of the starving artist. There's often a very, very close connection between art and money. And, you know, I'm curious how the ICRC has worked, so how the ICRC has developed art as a priority, how it maintains art as a priority, and what strategies the ICRC uses that perhaps other organizations can take from to, find, to really justify why art is such an important means of communication, a means of expression, and a means of interpretation of whatever the organization happens to be doing.
I think the question was to me first, right? That's a really tough one. We're not immune from, in no way are we immune from having to prioritize what the budget goes to. So it's a constant struggle. And on the part of your question, which is what advice could we give to other organizations, it's I think from my experience, it's really documenting the outcomes and the impact of what the artwork achieves or what the different activities achieve. There are also, and this is not, I think it's an artwork in its own right, but let's say big researches, these cost money, and sometimes it's also something that falls behind. It's not something you can count and say a donor that so and so thousands of food packs, or it's not the sexiest thing that an audience will think about as, oh, ICRC is doing its job. But it's our responsibility to figure out how to tell the story of why art is necessary. But it's a struggle, and so I don't have any one shot answer to this question.
I wasn't expecting a one-shot answer. That's why we have a lot of people answering and a lot of different interpretations. Pascal, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, there are two big things I'd like to deconstruct here. The first one is people who work just have to get paid, whether they're artists or communicators or delegates or whatever. It's not less important a job to be an artist, and why should we not be mindful and extremely attentive to how artists are paid, especially when they collaborate with organizations who put dignity at the very center of their operations. So that's the first thing, and I'm not saying this with any judgment. I'm saying this with the full awareness that in many of our economies, the artist who actually is the first creator of the content in the chain that then develops on from that creation is often the least paid or the lesser paid part of that entire infrastructure. We have a big art fair opening today in Geneva. The artists who produce the artworks, who actually enable the art fair to exist, might be, perceiving less money than the people who be reselling their artwork and reselling it again. So that's not specific to ICRC or the Red Cross. It's just a general observation on the place of artists in our economies. Second thing is deconstructing the idea that art would be some way or somehow frivolous. I don't think it is at all. I don't think we look at it historically in this way. Nobody would make the assumption that, great artists of the past that come to mind, and so many are jumping in your mind, would be seen as frivolous. So why would we make this assumption today with contemporary artists? Okay, Leonardo da Vinci, you don't have a Leonardo da Vinci every other year, but why should artists living today be considered as frivolous? They're not. So I'm saying this because then I connect this idea that we can be blocked in these silos of thinking, yeah, but people will understand if I communicate on what they expect me to do and to communicate. In other words, sending food, sending shelter, caring, showing that, ICRC, for instance, is doing its job. Yeah, sure. But we should also be very mindful of the fact that if we only talk about that and not about other things, then we also consolidate an image and an expectation around the organization, which is sometimes so restrictive for humanitarian workers themselves. I hear so many people here at ICRC tell me, well, you know what, this artist here really hits the nail on the head of showing and explaining what I actually do. And yeah, my life is not only about tragedy and horrible things. There are actually beautiful moments in war as well, but it's so difficult to express because people don't want to hear this complexity, or they just want their expectations to be comforted. And I think that's where artists can really disrupt that, and we get back to complexity, but we also get back to something else. It's the empathy and the connections with who you are here and now in your life. And perhaps if you can understand and comprehend that people in Ukraine are people like me. I mean, dads who have 3 kids who were just dropping them off to school and then moving on with their days, and suddenly this terrible thing happens. Well, if you manage to connect with that, well, you understand that humanitarian action is also a choice you can make in your daily life. And this comprehension then opens you to, yeah, perhaps financing the food that will be sent abroad, but for reasons that are not that of the expectation you had of what that work might be. Don't know if that made any sense. I haven't drunk enough coffee yet, sorry.
Well, I appreciate that it's early. Thank you so much for that. I think that restructuring that way of thinking is really, I think, really important. David or Claudia, would you like to jump in? David first.
Look, at my end, there's not a lot I can add to the excellent answers that Shelley and Pascal provided. I'd say only that on Pascal's point, I totally agree, and we certainly, the ICRC in Canberra, agree that we absolutely must be paying artists for the service that they provide, as others provide services to humanitarian action. They deserve to be paid in accordance with the quality of the service that they provide. That's very key. And I would go just a little bit further to say that in the constant rationalizing of our budgets, and we know that money is tight, and we are always, as humanitarian actors, trying to achieve far more than our budget allows. That's natural to who we are. But in all of that, I think we can, and I think we have to increasingly make the argument whenever it's necessary that using art in this way is precisely value for money. I mean, we pay for it, and we must pay for it adequately, but thereafter what we get is an enormous return. I mean, if you look at the kind of product that Claudia very kindly provided to us here in Canberra, it's a product that can have enormous and global reach, as you've already discussed. It's a product that can trigger emotion and trigger people's interest, that we can use and reuse. So it's worth it to make this investment in art, because it ultimately, for want of a better way to describe it, helps us to achieve our humanitarian objectives. And I think at the end of the day, that's absolutely key.
Thank you. Claudia, did you want to hop in there with a final thought?
Sure. I think everyone's covered a lot of really important sides of the cube. The biggest one I would say from an artist perspective is a lot of the questions of how much should be allocated to creating art, or creating art to further promote certain pieces of communication that organizations like the ICRC would like to. In any sector that isn't the arts, there's just a huge cultural undervaluing of what an artist's role in something in anything would involve. Not just from a practical sense, like you'd be paying for their subscriptions for design software, you'd be paying for their printing services, their internet bill, the same things that a business would be using to run. But I think a lot of people underestimate the training and the years of work and experience communicating visually, and how that is a skill that should be included in assessments of how much you should be paying for art that communicates. One really funny thing that immediately popped into my head was that, oh goodness, sorry. That popped into my head was that, oh my God, I have 2 phones. Sorry. An immediate thing that popped into my head was early in the pandemic when the Sunday Times in Singapore held a survey for 5 most essential jobs and 5 least essential jobs. Artist was 71% number 1 for the least essential job. And the shuddering irony of it all is that it's laid out on a designed page with icons for each job role and visual communication showing pie charts and percentages visually. So it's just, yeah, this really funny disconnect that anyone who is outside of the arts doesn't realize how much they're consuming visual communication every single day in every facet of their lives. So yeah, otherwise fully agree with what everyone else said.
Thank you, Claudia. I remember that now that you jogged my memory. I think it was my brother, a graphic designer, who shared it with me, and just the sheer irony of that. Thank you to everyone. I think let's go to a question from our audience now. We have a question from Wendy who asks, when times change and social and political climates change, what happens to the intrinsic value of the art itself? I think especially in relation with new social contexts, new ways of thinking or adjusted ways of thinking for broadening our horizons, especially whenever the art represents a problematic view of the world. Thinking of statues of Confederate heroes or people like Cecil Rhodes, or performing arts, plays like Finian's Rainbow. Claudia and Pascal, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, Pascal, go first. Thank you. I think that's an extremely important question, and it touches upon 2 things. The first one is, I think artists, and I don't really like to use this kind of general term because there's so many different types of artists, but there is one thing I admire, is the fact that they are very aware of change as it's unfolding. They often have this incredible capacity to sense, feel, and express something that is not consciously even understood yet or rationally discussed within society. And in this way, we have so many examples of artworks that encapsulate conversations and moments in time and society that are totally fascinating. And there is no moral lecture here of what I'm saying. It's not good or bad. It's just a fact. And therefore, based upon this, I'd say that the second step forward is to, especially in my job as a museum director, to be extremely humble in always making the effort to contextualize and to understand what the perception was when the artwork was made, in what context it developed, and how that perception and this context might be different from our perception and our context today, and provide ways of understanding and a kind of toolkit, a critical toolkit for viewers to make up their own minds in a very sound way. So the mistake for me is not making the effort to contextualize. And this, I guess, answers the question, because yes, situations are constantly shifting. What meant one thing one day might not mean the same thing the other day, especially throughout time. And it's a fact. Let's embrace it, but let's not rewrite history. And let's not censor based on our understanding today, which might have been very different from that of the past or another geographical region. Claudia.
Yeah, Claudia, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd say there's, on the question of political or social climate changing, how do we look back on art without it being problematic? How do we create art without it being something that will out ourselves as being ignorant? So there's 2 fronts. One is the context that Pascal mentioned, which is that anyone who is approaching any piece of visual media that they see in good faith would be trying to understand the context in which it was made and who made it. The second side of the coin would be of the subject and the subject matter, which comes back to the issue of the ethical and moral issue of what an artist has the right to communicate and whose stories do they have the right to tell. So this is a difficult one because it's really easy to look back on things in the past and say, well, those were the times, that was what everyone thinks, what everyone thought at that point in time. But I always like to, so this is an interesting one because I'm a research assistant on this research project on Australian comics from 1980 to 2020. And the head researchers came to the conundrum of what happens when we encounter media that is overtly racist by today's standards, or overtly ignorant or overtly sexist by today's standards. And so to solve this issue, the head researchers created a steering committee of people who work in the comics industry or have worked in the comics industry in that 40-year period, from different racial and ethnic backgrounds and from different cultural backgrounds of varying gender, and kind of would use this process to, when we get to a problem of that kind of issue, how would we address it based on this kind of community of opinion. But when we were deciding on this process, I posed the question of, say you're looking at a piece of work, a comic or a poster or something from early Australian 19th century media that is supposed to be a superhero story, but all of the villains are resembling Aboriginal and Black people. Like, an easy thing to say is, oh, well, it's a product of the time and people just thought that way then. But I like to pose the question of, what did the Black people think then? What did the Aboriginal people think then? What were First Nations people's reactions at the time? Not just what was the author's view at the time, because I think that is a better way to contextualize whether or not a piece of art has fundamentally shifted in meaning, or if it was already skewed from the moment that it was created. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you, just to bounce back on that, because part of the context is also being critical and very clear about who's telling the story and who is not telling the story, who is visible, who is not visible. The context is never only from the author's perspective. Can give you two examples. History is mainly written by the winners, right? The winners of conflicts and wars. But it's also in a very broader way written by those who have power. So right now I'm working on a big project with my colleagues who's called Who Cares, which is a pun, Gender and Humanitarian Action. And it will be a big exhibition connected to a 5-year postdoctoral research here in Geneva on the history of humanitarian action, but written from a gender perspective. So who's not in the history books, who was just as important, but never went down in history. That's one example. The other example, when you come to Geneva, because of course you'll come and see me in Geneva, when you walk into the museum, there's this big sentence on the wall that the founder of the museum put there, engraved it. It's by Dostoevsky from the brothers Karamazov. It's written in French. It's written "Chacun est responsable de tout devant tous." So in English, that would be everyone is responsible for everything in front of everyone else. So that was his way of thinking about humanitarian action, that you cannot escape the question of responsibility. Recently, we've developed a huge program around gender and diversity. This is a big annual theme. And I don't know if you read or speak French, but you might know that in most Latin languages, the masculine form prevails on the feminine in the way you write the words and adjectives and so on. And we did something that started quite a conversation. There's this big sentence on the wall, and we added letters to it to show that it's written in the masculine form, and what would happen if it would be written in the feminine form, because women are just concerned, and any expression of gender between male and female. So this is going back to your point, Claudia, that we have to especially be good at thinking of context in a very layered and multifaceted way, and it's never only about, oh, this was the time and let's move on. Absolutely.
That's fascinating. The politics of language itself is it could be a whole nother hour of discussion. Thank you both for that. Bryce or Chelly, did you want to jump in on that question? No, all right. Chelly?
I'm reminded of a current review that we are doing now in the ICRC of just reviewing all our external communications on how we actually have been inclusive or exclusive, or yeah. So thank you, Claudia, for pitching in that, the context analysis, which is that, so yes, there were the times, and this was how the author or the artist was thinking about it. But what about the person that's being portrayed? What about the rest of the environment? What were they thinking about it? And to Pascal's point, no contextualization will ever be complete without all the angles considered.
Thank you. All right, I'm cognizant that we only have a few minutes left, so I'd like to move on to another question from our audience, from Jesse, who asks, how is an artist chosen to collaborate? Or how is an artist chosen for a collaboration with the ICRC? Do they have to have political or social commentary already in their repertoire? Or I'm going to add myself into this conversation. Are artists just inherently political in their work? And Chelly, I'd like to hear from you first.
I'm actually really curious about Pascal's answer to this, especially because of the art selection for the vast number of projects that he handles. From us at the Regional Communication Center, or in my previous experiences with the ICRC and how we have selected artists, it has varied greatly depending on what it is that we need. However, we also have to, what we're very strict about, which maybe we should question at one point, is whether, the way that we work, we're neutral, we are not political, and we have to make sure that we align ourselves with partners who are also able to maintain or deliver the same modality of working. So at the moment, this is a big criteria for us. Again, whether that is something that we will change or not, or question, I think that's all to unfold, so that we're also continuing to improve the way we think. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chelly. Pascal, go for it.
Yeah, I think, Chelly, this is quintessential. As a museum director, and I'm also speaking here for my colleagues curator, it is that there are two ways of thinking of this. The first one is, let's collaborate with artists who could really benefit from a collaboration with our platform in terms of a new opportunity, or shifting gears in their career, or exploring new creative paths. It's especially important for me, as I said, to consider artists as peers, and therefore go into a selection process where we are also very aware of what is it for them that could be positive and a kind of breakthrough. That's one point. The second point is, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Museum is a sister organization of the movement, but it is not, according to international humanitarian law, an official member of the movement. We are not the museum of the ICRC, we are not the museum of the Federation, we are an independent structure. But within our status and within our founding agreements, we of course withhold, abide to, and fully and essentially respect humanitarian principles. So based on that, it's extremely, extremely important for me to engage a conversation with artists whom we think could be of interest for us and with us, and make sure they understand what's at stake. And this is going back to David's points at the very beginning of the conversation, when you were referring, David, to neutrality as often seen as a form of passivity or weakness. It's a wonderful opportunity to deconstruct that notion. And I can give you an example of a recent project. It was called Concerned 30 Artists and Humanitarian Issues. It was a huge exhibition. We invited 30 young artists trained in Geneva to create work and present it at the museum based on the assumption that Geneva is the world capital of humanitarian action. So what impact does it have on you when you're an artist trained in this city? And we went through this fascinating process to engage conversations with them, with so many people from the movement, and really brainstorm and totally deconstruct notions and ideas which you often have when you're not part of this organization and you see it from the outside. And, you know, everything can fit in the same box. Yeah, you know, the UN, ICRC, all these guys out there are kind of saving the world. That's an assumption that I often hear, and it's okay. We have to start with that and then deconstruct it. And we tend to, of course, at the end, work with artists who understand the subtleties, who accepted to enter in a conversation space where they suddenly say, whoa, I had no idea. I thought neutrality was you guys not actually engaging, but I see how neutrality is the essence of your engagement. And from then on, we're in a space where everybody understands each other, and that's essential. So that's how we also choose artists, but they choose us most of the time.
Claudia, would you like to speak to that?
Sure. I think from an artist's perspective, especially if you're independent or a freelancer and you have very little control over what jobs are going to end up coming and who's going to ask you to do something. I think if you have a consistency in your practice in the kinds of work that you do take on, that would show potentially to an organization like ICRC what kind of subject matter you've already worked with and whether you're capable of communicating something complex, inherently political, something related to social justice or social issues. If I look back on my history, I think at the core of all of the work I do, I have an interest in refugee issues. I have an interest in humanitarian issues. And I think a lot of artists have this inherently political and inherently socially, socially engaged position because we're really little cogs in the big machine of the world and we don't feel like we have very much power. So the only way we really do have power is by using our skills to help communicate broader ideas or help communicate complex ideas in a simple way to people who may not be involved. So even before working with the ICRC, I'd previously done work about how misinformation was affecting immunocompromised people in Australia at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. I taught comic and art workshops to refugee and migrant background children from a high school age group with the New South Wales organisation STARTS, who works with victims of torture and trauma. So I have this inherent belief in the power of storytelling and inherent belief in the power of telling our own stories. So the parties involved actually speaking up, because that's normally how art organically ends up in the world anyway. People will try to draw attention to their plight. People will try to draw attention to things that are affecting the greater world around them. And one of the first ways that we do that is through art. So I think kind of trying to keep that in your back pocket while you're working as an artist is a good way to continue to attract clients and organizations who are kind of aligned with that. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm cognizant that we're a couple minutes over time, so I think it's time to wrap up. I would like to first thank everyone who joined us either this evening if you're in Australia, or this morning if you're joining us from Geneva, or whatever time of the day it is for you. Thank you for being here. Bryce, you wanted to add something?
Sorry, I was going to let you finish, and then I was going to just express something that's already been expressed here a number of times, that we do have this very important relationship with the ICRC, and we've had it for many years. We have, I think, just finished the most recent series. Is that correct, Nancy, on forgotten conflicts?
We have one more article coming in a couple weeks, but it's one of my favorite features that we do every year, where we highlight conflicts that are either ongoing or, as the name of the series suggests, forgotten. In conjunction with the ICRC, we learn a lot about what's happening in the world through this series.
Yep. So do make sure you go on to Australian Outlook, which Nancy is the editor of, and at the moment at least, and check that out. And again, I'd like to express my thanks to the organisation. It's a really great partnership that we've got going, and may it last for many years more.
Thank you, Bryce. All right. So yes, thank you to everyone who joined us. Thank you to the ICRC, especially a huge thank you to Sarah and Emily, who are members of the ICRC mission in Canberra, for all of the work that they put into organizing this event. A huge thank you to our speakers and contributors, Shelley Esguerra, Claudia Chinyere Akole, Pascal Hufschmidt, Bryce Wakefield, and David Tuck. Thank you so much for sharing your ideas, your expertise with us tonight. If you enjoyed this event, I invite you to check out other upcoming events put on by the AAAA. We have a very full program over the next few weeks, and you can find upcoming events at internationalaffairs.org.au. I think Bryce has one more note, and then I will wrap it up. Sorry. Alrighty. So finally, before I say goodnight tonight, I would like to share my inspiration for organizing this event. My initial inspiration. It is my grandmother, Phyllis Coates, who I will put on the screen right now. She is a professional artist. She specializes in children's portraits, and I don't have a picture of it with me now, but she painted mine when I was 7. And I would like to wish her a very happy 97th birthday, which will be next week. So she is the inspiration for putting art into international affairs. And thank you so much to everyone for making this a reality. Thank you to our speakers, and good night or good morning.